The chamber smelled of tallow and old wool, and Miss Cecily Vane sat very still. Around her, the House of Lords arranged itself in its customary pattern, the shuffle of feet on stone, the rustle of papers, the cleared throats of men who had learned to fill silence with sound rather than leave it empty and admit they had nothing to say. She had attended the sessions in the gallery for years, watching from above while Edmund spoke the words she had written for him, watching the candlelight pool in the crests on the peers' coats. She had memorized the faces below. She had not, in all those years of watching, anticipated being among them. Edmund's coat was too broad across the shoulder. She had taken in the seams by 3/4 of an inch before dawn, working by a single candle in the Ashwick house's back parlor, while Mrs. Partridge held her breath and watched the door, pressing the altered cloth flat with her wide, careful hands and saying nothing, which was the most useful thing she could have done. The hat was better than the coat, the brim low enough to shadow Cecily's jaw, which was narrower than her brother's by a matter of judgment rather than obvious measurement. No one would know it was wrong unless they stood close and looked carefully, and men in this chamber did not generally look at the Duke of Ashwick with that degree of attention. Her gloves were Edmund's, too, slightly long in the fingers. She kept her hands flat on her thighs to prevent the excess fabric from telegraphing itself. She did not look at the man across the aisle. She felt him looking at her. Lord Henry Pelham, Earl of Stonebridge, was 31 years old and had sat 3 seats to the opposition diagonal for 6 years. She knew his record as well as she knew Edmund's. He had spoken against the Ashwick Enclosure Bill in committee, had written 2 pamphlets on agricultural rights that she had read with the focused attention she reserved for arguments worth the effort of refuting. He had brown hair gone slightly gray at the temple, a jaw that suggested patience rather than composure, and eyes the color of old gunmetal that moved across a room the way a man's eyes moved when he was accustomed to looking for things other people had decided not to see. He was looking at her now, and his gaze had precisely the quality she feared most. Not suspicion, but its predecessor. The unsettled attention of a man who cannot account for something, and who will not let the accounting go. Cecily fixed her gaze on the paper in her hands. Edmund's prepared remarks were written in her own hand and copied in a fair duplicate, so that if anyone examined the pages, they would see a gentleman's hasty scrawl rather than the even careful script she had been scolded out of 3 times by their father before she learned to disguise it. Her throat was steady. Her hands were steady. The only thing that was not steady was a small, cold point of knowledge lodged just below her sternum, that she had crossed a threshold this morning from which no ordinary woman returned, and that she had crossed it entirely of her own choosing, and that she was not sorry. If you have ever sat inside a decision that cannot be taken back, you understand the quality of that particular stillness. Edmund had contracted his fever 5 days ago. By the 2nd day, it was clear he would not be fit to sit before the session. By the 3rd, it was equally clear that without Ashwick's vote, the enclosure bill would pass in its current form, which meant that 300 families who had farmed the Ashwick common land for 3 generations would be displaced with nothing but a solicitor's letter and the assurance that progress required its sacrifices. Cecily had managed the Ashwick tenants' correspondence for 7 years. She knew those families. She knew the names of the farmers, and the names of their wives, and the names of their children, and the ages of the eldest sons who would be expected to find work elsewhere, in mills or on roads, doing the kind of labor their fathers had not trained them for. On the 4th day, Edmund had pressed his hand over hers on the counterpane and said in the specific voice he used only when he was too ill to perform confidence, "I cannot do it, Cecily." And she had looked at the note he had already written, which she had found on his writing desk when she brought his broth, a folded piece of his best paper in his own hand that authorized her to speak for Ashwick in whatever way she judged right. It was not signed with his title. It was signed Edmund, which was the name only she and their mother had ever used for him. She had put it in the bodice of her dress, against her ribs, where she could feel it with every breath. Mrs. Partridge had wept quietly into her apron when Cecily told her what she intended. The Duke's solicitor, a Mr. Fenwick, had turned the color of old tallow and said 3 times that it was not done, it was not done, it was simply not done. Cecily had reminded him, in the voice she used when Edmund was not present to use his own authority, that not done was a different calculation from impossible, and that Mr. Fenwick might keep his further objections to himself, or discover himself in need of a new client. She had slept 2 hours. She had dressed in the dark with Mrs. Partridge's hand steady at the coat's buttons and the hat's brim. She had walked out into the October morning with Edmund's face as best she could approximate it, and she had taken his seat. The session proceeded through 3 minor readings before the Ashwick Enclosure Bill reached its second call. Cecily had memorized her prepared remarks, memorized the amendments she intended to propose, memorized the counter-arguments she expected from the 2 peers who had spoken against tenant protections in committee. When her name was called, Edmund's name, the Duke of Ashwick's name, spoken into the stone air of that chamber as if it were any ordinary morning, she rose. Her voice, she had known since girlhood, was lower than most women's. Edmund had teased her about it. Their mother had despaired of it. She had learned to regard it as useful. She pitched it lower still now, and let it carry the careful, measured weight of a man accustomed to being heard without having to ask to be. She did not rush. She had been writing Edmund's speeches for 7 years, and she understood exactly how a sentence needed to breathe. She spoke for 11 minutes. The bill passed with the tenant protection clauses intact, and with a new amendment, moved by Ashwick's seat, requiring that displaced farmers be offered first right of tenancy on any new enclosed land within the original parcel. When she sat down, the chamber returned to its ordinary noise, and she was simply a duke among dukes, and no one had looked at her long enough to see anything wrong, except that when she glanced, briefly, across the aisle, Lord Henry was watching her with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not suspicion, exactly. It was the expression of a man who had been handed a piece of evidence that did not match his prior case, and who was too rigorous to throw either away. She did not meet his eyes. The corridor outside the chamber was cold and high-ceilinged, lit by afternoon light coming through windows that had not been cleaned since the reign of the previous century. Cecily moved through it with the particular straight-backed deliberateness she had spent 48 hours practicing, and she was nearly at the turn toward the anteroom where her waiting carriage could take her home, safely home, when he fell into step beside her. "Your Grace," he said. His voice was level. "Lord Stonebridge, I find myself wishing to speak with you about the amendment you introduced this afternoon." He matched her pace without effort. He was taller than she had gauged from the gallery. She had to adjust her chin upward slightly to maintain Edmund's posture, and she resented the adjustment. "The right of first tenancy clause. It is sound law. I would like to understand its provenance." "Its provenance is plain enough." "Its provenance," he said, "is the kind of specific procedural knowledge that a man develops either from years of legal training or from 7 years of managing his tenant's correspondence directly." A pause, measured. "I have read the Ashwick Committee submissions from the past 3 sessions. They bear a consistent style, a consistent command of agricultural particulars, and a consistent authorial voice. Today's remarks matched them exactly." She said nothing. Around them the corridor continued its ordinary business, clerks with papers, 2 junior lords in discussion, a footman carrying a covered tray. None of them were paying attention to this particular conversation. "I also notice," he said, his voice dropping half a tone, "that your left glove is loose at the wrist." She stopped. He stopped beside her. Around them, the corridor traffic continued in its oblivious way. Lord Henry was looking at her wrist, where a quarter-inch of bare skin had appeared above Edmund's glove, and the wrist it revealed was not a duke's. She did not move. She felt the cold air on that exposed inch of skin with the specific attention of someone who understands that small things have just become very large. She turned her head, very slowly, and looked at him. He looked back. His face was composed in a way that went beyond training. It was the composure of a man who had already decided something, not in the frantic way of someone who has made a sudden choice, but in the settled way of someone who had been constructing a decision for the past 3 hours and had arrived at it quietly. "You have 2 options," he said, quiet as a letter slipped under a door. "You may walk to your carriage, and I will say nothing today, and we will meet at Lord Cavendishmore's dinner tomorrow evening, where I will find that the Duke of Ashwick has made a full recovery, and you will spend the remainder of the session managing the question of whether I might or might not speak. Or you may come with me to the Cavendishmore Library now, and tell me whether you will hear my arguments regarding the bill's remaining provisions." Cecily held his gaze for a long moment. He did not look away, which she registered. Most men, when what they had said landed its full weight, looked briefly elsewhere. He did not. "The library," she said. The Cavendishmore Library was a long, low-ceilinged room that smelled of beeswax and cold leather, its shelves running floor to ceiling and its windows overlooking a narrow courtyard where the last of the autumn had stripped the plane trees to bare gray geometry against a pale sky. Lord Henry closed the door. Cecily removed Edmund's hat and set it on the table between them, and the fiction of the morning simplified itself into the plain air of the room. He looked at her without particular surprise. She thought that meant he had resolved the question in the corridor and was now simply at the next stage of his reasoning, which she could respect even if she did not entirely welcome its implications. "Miss Vane," he said. "My lord." "You spoke well this afternoon." "I am aware of what you intend by that observation," she said. "I intend a plain observation." He moved to the window, which she recognized as deliberate. He was putting space between them, making it possible for the conversation to happen without the weight of proximity pressing on it. She was grateful for that, in a way she would not have named aloud. "I have read the Ashwick submissions for 3 years. I disagree with approximately 1/3 of them. The quarter I disagree with most are the quarter I respect most, because they argue from particulars rather than principles." He turned. "I want to know if you will hear me on the subclause regarding common grazing rights." "I have objections to the subclause," she said, "that your pamphlets have not addressed. Then address them to me now." They argued for 1 hour and 20 minutes. Cecily had not expected to find it possible to argue in that room, with the hat on the table between them and the full weight of the morning's performance still in her coat. But the argument was real, and the man across from her was a worthy opponent. And at some point she stopped feeling the performance of Edmund's posture and simply stood in her own. He listened the way very few men had ever listened to her, with the specific attentiveness of a mind that adjusted itself when she introduced new information, that did not dismiss what it could not immediately refute, that asked follow-up questions aimed at the actual substance rather than at her manner of presenting it. At the close of it, he said, "You are right about the common grazing subclause." She said, "I know." Something crossed his face, almost a thing she had seen before in that room. Not quite amusement, something fractionally warmer. "The bill as amended will hold," he said. "If you can manage tomorrow's session." "I managed today's." "You did." He paused. "He is genuinely ill." "Yes." "And you wrote the committee submissions." I wrote everything he has submitted to this house in 7 years. She said it without particular bitterness, because bitterness would have required her to feel wronged by an arrangement she had entered voluntarily, and the situation was more complicated than that. Edmund was not cruel. He was simply accustomed to her, the way you become accustomed to the conditions that make your life possible. He is a capable man. We have an arrangement that has suited us both. Until now. Until now, she agreed. There was a pause, and in it she felt for the first time the full weight of the morning's crossing. Not its danger, which she had known in advance, but its otherness. She had been inside the chamber. She had spoken. She had been heard. The argument she had made this afternoon had moved in the world as an argument, not as a document passed through Edmund's hands. What happens now, she said, is that I return to what I have always been, which is my brother's able secretary. Is that what you would like to happen? She looked at him. He was watching her with the careful gunmetal attention, and his question was not rhetorical. He was asking because he did not know, and because he had decided he wanted to. She did not answer. She put Edmund's hat back on her head, adjusted the brim, and said that she would see him at Lord Cavendish Moore's dinner. The following morning she returned to the Ashwick house to find Edmund sitting up in bed and demanding a full account. He had their mother's ease of manner, and had been told since birth that he was gifted at things Cecily observed him being merely average at, but he had also been a good brother in the specific ways that mattered. He had never tried to diminish what she was, only to manage the social inconvenience of it. He listened to her account of the session with a mixture of genuine admiration and genuine discomfort, the way he always felt when the degree of his reliance on her became impossible to overlook. You introduced an amendment, he said. A sound one. Fenwick agrees it is legally clean. Without consulting me. You were unconscious. He rubbed his face. Stonebridge? Will not speak against it. That is not what I asked. He looked at her, and because they were twins and had been reading each other since before they had words for it, he saw something in her face that made him close his eyes briefly. Cecily. The bill is safe, she said. That is what matters. That evening, Mr. Fenwick had arranged a late consultation in the Cavendish Moor House's study with herself and Lord Henry and 2 other peers regarding the amendment's procedural language. She arrived as herself. In her own gown, the disguise folded and locked. Mrs. Partridge had pressed the cream muslin, the one Cecily had not worn since the previous spring, because there had been no occasion that seemed to warrant the effort of it. She was there as the Duke's sister, attending in place of her indisposed brother, which was a role the world accepted without particular attention, because it had always been willing to accept the role it could see while remaining blind to the one it could not. She arrived early. Lord Henry arrived 3 minutes after. They stood together at the cold fireplace in the moment before the others came in, and the fireplace between them had the quality of a thing that had been there for a long time and knew what had happened in front of it. Your brother is improving, he said. He is. That is good news. He was looking at the grate, though it creates certain complications for the session. I am aware of the complications, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then, in a voice that was not louder, but of a different weight, he said, I had a sister. She waited. Had, he said again, and the single past tense syllable settled in the room with the specific gravity of things that cannot be softened by any amount of preparation. Catherine, he said. She was 21 years old, 3 years ago, February. He paused. A fever, in the end. Not unlike your brother's, though faster. 3 days from the first symptom, and the physician we had did not recognize what it was until the second day. He reached into his breast pocket without hurry and took out a very small oval frame, not much larger than a calling card, and held it briefly in his palm the way you hold something you are showing rather than offering. I carry this because it is better than carrying nothing. In the miniature, a young woman with his eyes looked out from painted ivory with an expression of caught attention, as if she had been called by name mid-thought. She read everything I wrote, he said. Every speech before I gave it, every pamphlet before it went to print. She argued with me about things I believed I had settled, and she was frequently right about the things I did not take her corrections on. He put the miniature back carefully. The same deliberate pocket. The same small gesture of returning. When I work on this bill, it is partly because I know what 300 families stand to lose, and partly because I know what it is to have had a person who understood everything about your work, and to have lost them. Cecily stood with the cold fireplace between them, and let what he had said be what it was. She did not offer comfort in the form of words. Because she had known since girlhood that comfort offered too quickly was simply a way of making the listener feel less uncomfortable. She stayed with it. Then she said, "I am sorry about Catherine." "I know," he said. "I can see that you are. I want you to know," he continued, "that I intend to speak in support of the amendment at the final reading. Not for the Duke of Ashwick. For the bill's merits. And for the mind that produced the first right of tenancy clause, which I believe to be the most precisely drafted provision this House has considered in the present session." She held his gaze, and the room was very quiet. "The clause is sound on its own terms," she said carefully. "It is," he agreed. "But so is its author." He paused. "I wanted you to know that I understand the difference between the two." The others arrived then, and the conversation became procedural, and what had been between them at the fireplace closed over itself like water settling, leaving no visible mark. Edmund recovered. By the 6th day, he was at his desk reviewing the amendment's language with Fenwick and pronouncing himself satisfied, which meant he was reviewing work Cecily had done and confirming that it met his standard, which was the arrangement they had always had, and she stood at the window and watched the autumn street below and felt the particular tiredness of a person who has done something significant and returned to a room where its significance is politely not discussed. The dinner at Lord Cavendish Moore's that Thursday was the last gathering before the session's final reading. Edmund attended, slightly pale but composed and present, in the way he was always present at social occasions, which was comfortably and without requiring anything from himself beyond a pleasing manner. He introduced Cecily to the assembled company as "my sister, who has been my able secretary in my recent indisposition," and he said it with the warmth of genuine gratitude, which made it harder to hear than if he had said it with indifference. The dismissive label had been with her a long time. To the world that occupied that dining room, she was the Duke's clever secretary. She had heard it first at the age of 19, said by an aunt at a garden party. "Oh, Cecily has always been terribly clever. Quite uselessly clever for a girl. She'll end up her brother's secretary." It had been said with the specific tone of people who believe they are describing a fact rather than delivering a verdict. She had heard it many times since. She had learned to keep her face perfectly still when she heard it, which was a different skill from not feeling it. Lady Cavendish Moore used it that evening with the confident, practiced ease of a woman who has run rooms for 20 years and knows the weight of every word in them. "The Duke's clever secretary," she told an arriving earl, gesturing toward Cecily at the far end of the table. "She has been quite useful to Ashwick during his indisposition." It was said with the perfect pitch of a dismissal, wearing a compliment's clothing, and the room absorbed it the way rooms absorbed all such calibrations, without visible acknowledgement. as if the rearrangement of a person's worth were simply part of the evening's ordinary furniture. Lord Henry, seated 3 places from her, said nothing. He looked at his plate for a moment, and then he looked at her, and his face held the specific expression she had come to recognize as his own, the composed surface, and underneath it, something she could not entirely name, only register. He looked away before she could decide whether she wanted him to act or not. Edmund raised his glass and said something agreeable about the quality of the claret, and the conversation moved forward, and Cecily sat inside the evening with her hands folded in her lap, and the label fitting around her throat with its familiar and particular weight. She spent that night in the back parlor of the Ashwick house with a candle and the amendment drafts, making marginal notes for Edmund's use in the final session, and the house was very quiet around her. The street outside had gone still. Somewhere above her, Edmund slept in his recovered health, and somewhere in the city, Lord Henry had his own fire and his own papers, and the small oval portrait in his breast pocket. She thought about what it would mean to spend the next 20 years in this chair. She thought about it honestly, which required her to sit for some time in the specific discomfort of a future she had not chosen, but had never found a way to refuse. She was not a woman who wept easily. She was honest enough with herself to admit that what she sat with, in the quiet of that room, was not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The grief's more composed sister. Mrs. Partridge appeared at 11 with tea, set it down without asking, and said, in her way of saying things that were not entirely the thing they appeared to be, "You will be in the gallery tomorrow, miss." "Yes," Cecily said. "I will be in the gallery." "As you've always been." "As I've always been." Mrs. Partridge looked at the tea and at the candle and at the amendment notes in their careful stacks, and then she said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has watched a household long enough to understand it, "It will not always be the gallery, miss." Cecily looked at her. "You cannot know that." "No," said Mrs. Partridge, "but I know you." She went out and closed the door softly behind her. The final reading of the Ashwick Enclosure Bill took place on a gray Thursday morning, the light coming in low and thin through the chamber's high windows. Edmund sat in his proper seat, restored to his rightful person and his rightful coat, and Cecily sat in the gallery above, which was where she had always sat, which was the place assigned to her by a world that had not yet found a use for her that did not require someone else's name on the page. She watched the chamber arrange itself below with the attention of 7 years' practice, and she thought that the gallery's view was actually very good. She had always been able to see everything from here. She was not sure whether to find that ironic or simply sad. Edmund rose to speak. He had reviewed the notes, knew the amendment's provisions and their justifications, and he was a man who could carry a chamber on the strength of his manner and his rank, even when his knowledge was imperfect. He began the prepared remarks. His voice was steady. His posture was correct. He lost the thread 4 minutes in. It was not dramatic. It was a pause, a reaching for a phrase that did not arrive, a slight shift in his posture that she recognized the way you recognize a person you have known your entire life. The specific moment when Edmund ran out of what he had memorized and had to locate the next thing in himself. He could do it. He had done it before. He was not fully well, and the chamber had the weight of 100 careful attentions pressing on it, and the pause stretched, and Lord Burridge, 3 seats along, began to gather himself in the way that men gather themselves when they sense an opening in what they have been opposing. Lord Henry rose. The chamber settled toward him the way chambers settle toward men who have learned to carry weight in silence before they carry it in words. He did not look at Lord Burridge. He did not look toward Edmund. He looked, for a moment, at the gallery. And Cecily felt that gaze from 30 feet above, as if it had crossed no distance at all. "My lords," he said, "this House has spent a fortnight considering the Ashwick Enclosure Bill in its amended form. In that fortnight, it has heard arguments of uncommon clarity, arguments grounded not in principle alone, but in the specific agricultural circumstances of specific families on specific land. I have opposed provisions of this bill in committee. I will not oppose the amendment." He paused, and the chamber let him pause. The first right of tenancy clause is among the most precisely drafted protections for agricultural tenants that this House has considered in the present session. The draftsmanship deserves to be acknowledged plainly. He turned, not fully toward the gallery, but at an angle that left no possible ambiguity about the direction of his attention. "Ashwick's voice has been consistent throughout this session," he said, "and it has been consistently correct. Cecily Vane speaks for Ashwick. She has always done so. The gallery did not erupt. It was not that kind of room. The people in it understood the nature of the space below and kept their reactions inside the narrow register that propriety permitted. There was a shift, the way a room of careful people shifts when something true has been said aloud that they have all been arranging themselves around without naming. Cecily heard it as a collective held breath that released itself slowly. She kept her face level. Her hands were in her lap, and she did not let them move. Edmund, still standing below, turned toward the gallery. In his face she saw three things at once: surprise, which she had expected, and recognition, which she had also expected, and a third thing she had not, which was the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just watched someone offer to share it. Lord Burrage had sat back down. Lady Cavendish Moore, present in the gallery 3 seats to Cecily's right, had gone very still with a quality of stillness that suggested the revision of several calculations. The vote was called. The bill passed with the amendment intact. 300 families on the Ashwick estate would keep their right of first tenancy on the enclosed parcels. There would be a solicitor's letter, and it would contain terms those families could survive. She did not go to Edmund. She went out into the corridor and stood in the cold stone passage with her hands at her sides, and she breathed. She had been holding her composure for 2 weeks with the specific conscious effort of a person who does not trust what will happen if she stops. And now she was standing in a corridor with no one watching, and she let it be a little less controlled, just for a moment, just for the length of several long, slow breaths. She was still there when she heard his step. Lord Henry came to stand beside her without announcing himself, at a distance that was correct and that felt, nevertheless, like presence. He held out, without preamble, a folded piece of paper, and she recognized it before she took it. Edmund's note, the one she had carried in her bodice through every session, which had been missing from its place since the corridor 2 weeks ago, when she had been focused on his hand at her wrist and had not noticed it slip away. He said, "I kept it as evidence. I did not need to keep it any longer." She took the note. She unfolded it and looked at Edmund's handwriting. "Speak for Ashwick in whatever way you judge right." And then she folded it again and held it in her hand, and the whole of the past 2 weeks was in the paper's weight. "You should not have spoken without warning me," she said. "I would have liked to have been prepared." "No," he said. "You would have refused." She considered that. He was not wrong. "Yes," she said. "I would have." "Then I was right not to warn you." He said it evenly, without apology, and she found she could not disagree with the logic of it. "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. His face had the quality she had seen at the fireplace, the composed surface present, and underneath it, the person who had put the portrait back in his pocket and then spoken directly to her, which was not a thing he did with everyone. I intend to raise the question of the Reform Committee's agricultural provisions in the new session, he said. There are specific gaps in its working knowledge that I believe could be addressed, and I find myself in need of someone to correspond with on the subject. He paused. Someone who knows the Ashwick tenant situation specifically, and who has been studying the committee's submissions since at least the session of 1813. My brother's correspondence goes through Fenwick, she said, not because she believed this was the answer he was seeking, but because she wanted to hear the answer it produced. I am not proposing to write to your brother, he said, or to his secretary. He said the last two words with a precision that constituted, in that particular moment, their entire dismantling. I am proposing to write to Miss Vane, if she is willing to receive such letters. She stood with the folded note in her hand, and the corridor cold around them, and the sound of the chamber behind her slowly restoring itself to its ordinary business. And she felt, beneath her sternum, where the note had lived for 2 weeks, a warmth beginning that was careful and specific and entirely real. I will write to you directly, she said. As Miss Vane. That is precisely what I hoped you would say. They stood in the corridor for a long moment, not touching, the stone and the thin autumn light around them, and the space between them had the quality of a threshold that neither had yet crossed, but that both now understood was there. It was chaste, and it was charged, and it was in its restraint, entirely honest. She returned to Edmund that evening. He was in the drawing-room with Fenwick and a small celebratory measure of brandy, and he rose when she entered with the specific expression she had seen on his face in the chamber, the weight redistributed. You wrote the bill that passed today, he said. We wrote it, she said. You kept the seat for 7 years. That is not nothing. Cecily. He set down his glass. He looked at her with the direct sincerity he rarely deployed because it cost him something to use it, the knowledge that she would see exactly how far it went and exactly where it stopped. I have been thinking, since Stonebridge spoke, about what I have allowed to be understood about your role here, about what I have been content to allow. She waited. I intend, in the new session, to speak to the question of your acknowledged authorship in the committee submissions. It will not change the formal position overnight. It will be in the record. He held her gaze. It should have been there 3 years ago. She considered this. It was not the whole of what ought to be different. It was something. That would be a beginning, she said. He said, with the honesty of a man who has finally run out of the comfortable middle distance, You are considerably more than a secretary. Yes, she said. I am. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And between them the specific knowledge that they had always had of each other was present in the room. The knowledge that they could not deceive each other about things that mattered, and had long since agreed not to try. She went downstairs after supper. The back parlor was warm, Mrs. Partridge having built the fire before she retired, and the amendment drafts were in their neat stacks, and the fresh paper was ready beside the candle, and the tea was still faintly warm in its pot. She sat down. She drew the clean paper toward her. She wrote at the top of the first page, in her own hand, with no disguise to it. She addressed it to Lord Henry Pelham, Earl of Stonebridge, and wrote at the top her own name without alteration. The letter ran to 4 pages. She wrote about the common grazing subclause, which she had more to say about than their argument in the library had exhausted. She wrote about the specific families on the northwestern Ashwick parcel, and what the first right of tenancy clause would mean to them in the first spring following enclosure. She wrote one paragraph that was not precisely about the committee's provisions, and that she crossed out twice before she decided that it was true enough to remain, which was that she had appreciated being heard as herself, regardless of the circumstances that had made it possible. She sealed the letter with Ashwick's wax, which she had always used, but she signed it with her own name only, without the Duke's, and she put her name on the outside of the envelope without alteration and without apology. Several weeks later, a letter arrived at the Ashwick house in a hand she had memorized from 6 years of committee submissions on the opposition diagonal. It was addressed on the outside to Miss Vane. This was not a form of address that had previously appeared on correspondence delivered to this house, and the footman who brought it up looked briefly uncertain about its destination before placing it on the salver with the morning's other post. She carried it to the back parlor. The fire was lit. The plane trees in the street outside had shed the last of their leaves. The morning was gray and still and entirely ordinary in the way that mornings can be ordinary when they are about to become something else. She broke the seal. She read. The letter was about the Reform Committee. It was also, in the way of certain letters written by careful people who understand that a stated subject can contain its full weight and still be about more than itself, about more than the Reform Committee. He wrote about the agricultural provisions with precision and without condescension, which she noted. He wrote about Catherine once, one sentence, in the context of a point about why certain kinds of knowledge did not survive being passed through intermediaries. The sentence was not performed. He had written it and moved on from it in the same breath, which was the way you mentioned the things that were true and continuing, rather than the things you needed the other person to respond to. At the close, he wrote, I look forward to your reply. Not to Ashwick's. Yours. She read it twice. Then she folded it once and set it beside the candle. She was still at the desk an hour later, when Mrs. Partridge looked in to ask about the fire, and Cecily said yes, please. And the reply was already half written, and outside the window the first snow of the season had begun to fall, quiet and steady, covering the London street in white that was perfectly indifferent to everything that had happened in the weeks just past, and perfectly indifferent to everything that was beginning now. The candle burned. She wrote her own name at the bottom of the page. The snow kept falling. If you stayed with Cecily's story until the end, leave a word in the comments for the thing you have done under someone else's name, and the day you stopped,